The ranch house in Texas had not changed much since I was a child. The stone walls still breathed heat in the summer, the floorboards still groaned like they were whispering secrets, and the kitchen still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. For years, I told myself these familiar things meant stability, that this place in its stillness carried the weight of family. But tonight, as the cicadas sang outside and the porch light threw its weak yellow glow across the yard, I realized the truth: this house was never mine. The chair by the kitchen door said it all. Always the same chair, tucked just far enough from the table to mark distance. My place not at the table with the others, but near the draft by the exit, like I might need to slip out quickly. I used to think it was coincidence just where they put me because the table was full. But year after year, holiday after holiday, the chair never moved. It became its own kind of monument. Not to family, not to love, but to exclusion. I sat there again tonight watching my father swirl his wine glass like it was a gavel. Richard Carter, retired businessman patriarch with a voice that still shook the room even when he barely spoke. He raised his glass, nodded to Nathan, and said, "Family first," the same toast he had made every year. But when he said family, his eyes never landed on me. His gaze stayed fixed on my brother, the so-called successor, the man who had never done a hard day's work but carried himself like the world owed him. Nathan leaned back in his chair, the keys to his new luxury car dangling in his hand, clinking with every careless shake. He loved the sound of them like applause only he could hear. Across from him, Sophie, the sister-in-law, with the perfect smile and perfectly curated Instagram feed, angled her phone to capture the glow of the candles, the polished silverware, the faces she wanted the world to see. When she posted later, I knew I'd be cropped out. Just as I always was. My mother sat in her usual place, a lace handkerchief folded neatly beside her plate. Laura Carter smiled her soft smile, the one she used whenever tension threatened to slip into the room. That smile had raised me, taught me that silence was safer than truth. "Don't make it worse, Emily," she had whispered so many times through the years. Tonight she didn't have to say it. The handkerchief was already in her hand, waiting for tears she would wipe, but never acknowledge. The chair dug into my back as if to remind me of its role. I shifted slightly, my knees grazing the doorframe, the exit right there. How many times had I fantasized about standing up and leaving while their laughter filled the air without me? But leaving never seemed simple. I told myself it was duty or love or some fragile thread of hope that one day the chair might move. That one day my name might be spoken with pride, not pity. Aunt Miriam offered me a thin smile from the far end of the table. Her rosary beads, faded from decades of prayers, hung around her wrist. She glanced at me as if to say she saw it too, but her eyes quickly dropped to her plate. Miriam's kindness had always been like that, gentle, fleeting, powerless against the louder voices. I traced the rim of my glass, my reflection warped by the water inside. I thought of Jonah Reeves, my oldest friend, who once told me, "Emily, keep the receipts. Paper doesn't lie." His words echoed now, louder than my father's toast, louder than Nathan's smug laughter. Somewhere in my briefcase back at the hospital locker room were documents, copies of records, proof of things they preferred to erase. Proof that I wasn't invisible. Maya's voice came back to me too. Maya Tran, the nurse who stood quietly beside me in long shifts, who had slipped me a small blue USB with a whisper. "Keep this safe. One day you'll need it." That little piece of plastic felt heavier than any heirloom in this house. It carried truth. My truth. The night dragged on, the conversation circling around Nathan's success, Sophie's new PR campaign, and my mother's soft hums of agreement. I sat silently, the chair by the door pressing its cold judgment into my spine. But beneath that silence, something stirred. For the first time, I didn't just feel the sting of exclusion. I felt clarity. This house might look the same as it always had, but I wasn't the same girl who had once accepted that chair without question. The cicadas outside grew louder, their chorus almost drowning out Nathan's laughter. I let the sound wash over me, grounding me in the present. My father raised his glass again. Family first, but his words slid past me, meaningless now. Because tonight, for the first time, I believed something different. Family wasn't defined by who kept me at the door. It wasn't locked in this house or in the photographs where I had been cut out or in the toasts that never included my name. Family was in the quiet allies who handed me receipts and the truth stored on a small blue USB in the strength that had grown inside me every time I was told to stay silent. The chair by the door would always be theirs. But my story, that was mine. The table was long enough to seat 14 polished oak that had outlived 3 generations of Carters. But no matter how wide it stretched, there was never room for me. Tonight was no different. Richard Carter, my father claimed the head seat as always, the same place he'd ruled from like a general at his war table. His wine glass was already half full, fingers curling around the stem as if it were a scepter. Nathan sat directly to his right, the spot of honor. My brother leaned back in his chair, tipping the keys to his car between his fingers, so the metallic jingle punctuated his words. He liked that sound. It reminded everyone he had things worth showing off. Father watched him with a pride so thick it filled the air, pride that had never once spilled my way. On Nathan's other side, Sophie angled her phone, the front camera lit like a stage. The screen cast a glow across her carefully painted face as she narrated to an invisible audience. "Family dinner night at the Carter Ranch," she said sweetly, adjusting the frame so Richard's grin and Nathan's smug posture filled the screen. My face was out of view as if I wasn't even in the room. I leaned forward slightly, testing the edge of her frame, but she shifted the phone without looking. Crop achieved. Erasure complete. The sound of cutlery clinking echoed like a script rehearsed too many times. My mother, Laura, smiled faintly as she passed the breadbasket down the table. Her lace handkerchief peeked from her lap, ready for any mess, but she didn't look at me. She never did when the division was made so clear. She preferred her version of peace, the kind that required silence from me. "Don't make it worse, Emily," her eyes seemed to say. I had been given my place. Not next to them, not opposite them, not anywhere near the center of that long, shining oak. Instead, I sat at the far edge, a chair dragged close to the door, half in and half out of the light. The table might as well have been a stage, and I was seated behind the curtain. I tried not to stare at the empty plate set before me, smaller than the others, as if the detail had been overlooked, or as if it hadn't. Then Richard's voice cut through the small talk, the weight of it enough to pull every eye toward him. "You'll be comfortable there." His lips curled into a laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all, more like a gavel striking down. His words echoed across the table and landed squarely on me, sealing my seat, sealing my role. The others chuckled softly as though the joke was harmless, but there was nothing harmless about it. In that sentence, my father had mapped out the architecture of our family. Nathan at his right hand, Sophie, the curator of image, Laura, the keeper of fragile peace, and me pushed to the margins, made comfortable only in exile. I shifted in my chair, the wood pressing into my back like a brand. My hand brushed the briefcase I'd tucked by the door, its leather edges worn but solid. Jonah's words came to me. "Keep the receipts?" Emily, inside the papers and files, whispered promises of a different narrative, one they couldn't so easily erase. Aunt Miriam's rosary beads clinked softly as she reached for her glass. Her eyes flicked toward me, pity etched in the lines of her face. She mouthed something, maybe sorry, maybe just the ghost of a word. But then she looked away, folding her hands in prayer against conflict she never dared interrupt. Meanwhile, Sophie was laughing into her phone, panning across Richard and Nathan. "See family first?" she said, echoing my father's favorite line. The live stream comments popped up in rapid fire, little hearts and praises flooding in, none of them knowing the truth of who was missing from the frame. None of them noticing the empty chair by the door where the unwanted daughter sat half-shadowed. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs to steady myself, nails biting into the fabric of my dress. The humiliation was thick, but thicker still was the clarity building inside me. They could crop me out of photographs, laugh me into silence, seat me at the edge of the room, but none of it erased the truth I carried. The divide at that table was more than seating arrangements. It was the story of my life, written into furniture and gestures, repeated until it felt permanent. But permanence is an illusion. Tables can crack, chairs can break, and live streams can glitch. One day, I knew their curated frame would falter. And when it did, the world would see what they tried so hard to hide. For now, I sat quietly staring at the oak surface, gleaming under the chandelier, watching Nathan spin his keys and Sophie capture her angles. My father raised his glass and smirked at the screen Sophie held up. Family first, he declared, his voice proud, his tone final. But in the shadows by the door, I whispered to myself, not this family, not this frame. The first time I realized erasure wasn't private, but public was on Nathan's birthday. The house smelled of buttercream and cigar smoke, laughter bouncing off the ranch walls. A cake as wide as the kitchen island sat in the center, glossy with icing and sparklers that hissed like fireworks. Across the top, in careful red letters, was written only one name, Nathan. No mention of Emily, no nod to the sister who had baked every cake for years when the caterer didn't come through, no acknowledgement that I was standing right there. When the candles flared, Sophie angled her phone again, streaming the moment to her curated audience. She leaned into Nathan, fixing his collar, her camera capturing Richard's proud smile. I hovered at the edge of the shot holding plates and forks, waiting for anyone to invite me closer. No one did. Nathan puffed his chest before blowing out the flames, and when I moved to clap Sophie's elbow, nudged me gently, just enough to push me outside the frame. The knife sliced into the cake pieces passed around the table like offerings, and I waited. The last slice came and went without my plate being touched. My father lifted his glass crimson wine swirling under the chandelier. Family first, he declared, his eyes warm on Nathan. Then he glanced at me, a sharp flicker in his gaze like a reminder of where I stood. On the outside, always. On the outside. Weeks later, it happened again, this time in the quiet reverence of church. The air inside St. Mark's carried the scent of wax and old wood. I sat 2 rows behind my family, watching Pastor Davis shake Richard's hand. His voice carried easily through the sanctuary. "You've raised a fine son," he said, clapping Nathan on the shoulder. "A fine son." The words echoed, bouncing through the pews, sticking to the stone arches. My breath caught. Heat flushed through me. I leaned forward and whispered, "I'm here too." It wasn't loud, but it was enough. My voice cracked against the silence like a fragile glass shattering. Pastor Davis didn't hear, but my father did. Richard turned slowly, his wine-dark eyes fixing on me with a warning sharp as steel. He smiled, polished, practiced, and said to the pastor loud enough for every ear in the church, "She imagines things." The congregation chuckled. Not cruelly, not viciously, but with the kind of amused dismissal that cuts deeper than anger. A ripple of laughter passed like a breeze, carrying my voice away, erasing me before I could even stand. I sank back against the pew, my chest tight. Laura touched her lace handkerchief to her lips as though hiding a cough, but her eyes told the truth. "Don't make it worse, Emily." Beside her, Sophie raised her phone to snap a quick picture, the angle perfect, the lighting soft, the frame flawless. I wasn't in it. Gaslight isn't always a private act. Sometimes it's a performance, a family chorus, a laugh track timed to erase one person's reality. That day, the church pews became an audience, their polite amusement cementing my invisibility. Aunt Miriam squeezed her rosary until her knuckles whitened her lips, moving in silent prayer. For me? For peace, I couldn't tell. She didn't speak. She never did when it mattered. But I remembered Jonah's voice in my head, steady as always. "Paper doesn't laugh, Emily. Paper doesn't vanish." He'd told me to keep records. I thought of the folder waiting in my briefcase, of Maya slipping me the blue USB that hummed with quiet electricity. Proof waited for me in those artifacts, even if the world around me was busy rewriting me out of the story. As the service ended, the congregation rose in song. Nathan shook hands, Richard received praise. Sophie captured it all for her followers. And me, I stood at the back, the hymn book heavy in my hands, my mouth too dry to sing. Their laughter still rang in my ears, a sound that said I didn't exist. Not really. But here's the thing about gaslight: it burns, but it also leaves smoke. Smoke that lingers, that proves a fire once burned. Tonight, in the hollow echo of those pews, I promised myself I would keep the smoke, the ashes, the evidence. One day, when their curated image cracked, I would open the folder plug in the USB and let the truth speak louder than their laughter ever could. For now, I walked out into the Texas sun, its heat unforgiving but honest. The cicadas screamed louder than the church bells, reminding me that silence can hold a roar if you know how to listen. They thought I imagined things, but I carried proof. and proof does not imagine. I was halfway through my shift when the notification lit up my phone. Sophie had posted again. I almost ignored it. Her feed was a glossy parade of Carter perfection polished to a shine so blinding it made my eyes ache. But something in me still hoped. Like maybe this time I'd see myself included. The photo froze me where I stood. My father at the center, his wine glass lifted in a toast, Nathan beside him with that lazy grin, and my mother tilting her head just so her lace handkerchief folded neatly on her lap, like it belonged in the frame as much as she did. Aunt Miriam hovered in the corner, smile weak but visible. And Sophie always. Sophie angled perfectly to catch the light, her phone still visible in her hand, the camera reflected in the glass behind them like a magician caught in her own trick. But me gone. Cropped clean out as if I had never been sitting 2 chairs away. I could almost feel the edge of the scissors slicing through pixels, removing my body from the narrative. The caption glared up at me in sharp black text, "Proud family moment." My throat tightened. Proud family moment. The world scrolling past that image wouldn't know I had been there, wouldn't know I had spoken, laughed quietly. Handed the bread basket across the table. To them, it was a perfect square of unity. A family whole. A family without me. Even pixels know I don't belong. The thought landed heavy, bitter, true. I imagined the screen as a mirror, but one that had been polished until I disappeared from the reflection. I scrolled down past hundreds of comments blooming like wildflowers. What a beautiful family. So proud of Nathan Goals. Heart stars, clapping hands. No one asked where I was. No one noticed the seam where my body had been erased. They consumed the image the way people consume all curated illusions, quickly, unquestioningly. I remembered Jonah's words again. Screens lie, Emily. Files don't. He had said it with that steady conviction of his tapping the old leather briefcase he carried like a weapon of truth. I had smiled then, not quite believing the weight of it. But looking at Sophie's post, I understood. A photo could erase me with a flick of 2 fingers. A document couldn't. Still, it cut deep. It always did. Later that night, I sat on the porch while cicadas screamed into the humid Texas dark. I watched the light from the house spill out through the windows, golden rectangles against the black. Inside, Sophie laughed, probably refreshing her post, reading the flood of praise, confirming her version of the story. Nathan clinked his keys. Richard swirled his wine, Laura's handkerchief fluttered in her hand as she smiled at the performance. The family image machine spun on relentless, fueled by likes and silence. My phone buzzed again. Another photo. This time the caption read, "So blessed. Family first." My father's line repackaged for Sophie's audience tagged to Nathan's grin. I zoomed in on the corner of the picture on the faint blur of my sleeve that had escaped the crop. Just a fraction of fabric. Not a person, not a daughter, just an error. The rage didn't come hot. It came cold, a steady stream of clarity. If Sophie could erase me from a frame, I could build a frame she couldn't touch. If she could crop me out of pixels, I could anchor myself in paper and receipts in things heavier than filters. I thought of Maya's small blue USB, waiting like a seed in the bottom of my drawer. I thought of hospital records, billing sheets, voice memos, evidence that no caption could erase. The Carter family image machine was powerful, but it was fragile too. Fragile because it depended on lies being believed, on silence holding. I looked at the photo one last time before setting the phone face down. Their smiles, their staged perfection, their captioned pride, it was all a house of cards propped up by erasure. And houses of cards, no matter how glossy, eventually fall. Inside the house, laughter rose again, muffled through the glass. I leaned back against the porch chair, the one by the door, the one they always saved for me. For once, I didn't feel the sting of exclusion. I felt the weight of proof waiting in my hands, heavier than Sophie's camera, stronger than her edits. Pixels lie, but paper remembers. I found it by accident. I was cleaning out the bottom drawer of my old desk, the one that had followed me from high school to college and back into this house like a reluctant shadow. Dust clung to the handles, and the drawer stuck as if it didn't want to be opened. When I tugged hard enough, something inside crumpled and crackled. That's when I saw them. The torn pieces of a letter, edges jagged like teeth marks, words half buried under shreds of wood and dust. My hands shook as I gathered them, carefully piecing together the puzzle on top of the desk. Some corners were missing, some words lost forever, but the letter's intent shone through. The emblem of the nursing school at the top, the bold letters spelling out "Scholarship Awarded." My name, Emily Carter, typed neatly underneath, still visible, even through the rips. I stared at it until the words blurred. All those nights I had doubted myself, convinced I wasn't good enough, wasn't chosen, hadn't even been considered, it had been a lie. Not because the school hadn't seen me, but because someone else hadn't wanted me to see myself. I remembered asking my father about the scholarship years ago when friends whispered about awards they'd received. His voice had been calm, final, like the sound of a gavel. "We don't waste time on fantasies." Back then I believed him. Believed the school had passed me over, believed my place was smaller, my work less. Believed that nursing was not a dream, but a chore I had invented to make myself feel important. I carried his dismissal like a scar, let it carve doubts into every decision. Now the truth sat in torn fragments before me. He hadn't just dismissed me, he had erased me. He had stolen my chance to believe in myself before I even began. The sound of clinking glass carried down the hallway. Richard was in the dining room again, swirling his wine, probably telling Nathan how proud he was. I pressed my palm against the pieces of paper, holding them down as though they might float away, disappear again if I didn't anchor them. Even torn, the letter was proof. Maybe even stronger proof because of its scars. Whole letters could be forged, pristine envelopes faked. But torn edges, jagged and dirty, spoke louder. They told a story of someone who had tried to silence me and failed. I thought of Sophie with her phone cropping me from pictures, spinning captions into fairy tales. I thought of my mother with her lace handkerchief smiling at peace instead of truth. I thought of Nathan with his keys jingling, celebrated as the heir while I was told to settle for scraps. And above it all, Richard's voice. Family first. The family he meant never included me. I slid the pieces into a clear plastic sleeve from my nursing textbooks, sealing them like evidence. The crinkle of the plastic was satisfying, like locking a door. For years, I'd let them hold the keys. Not anymore. Jonah's words rang again. "Receipts, Emily. Always keep receipts." I could almost hear his voice across the years, calm, steady, unshakable. And here it was, one of the first receipts of my life, proof that my worth had been recognized long before my father told me otherwise. Proof that the lie was his, not mine. The drawer gaped open, empty now, except for dust and the faint smell of cedar. I shut it slowly, almost reverently. The sound of the wood sliding into place echoed like closure, but not finality. This was just the beginning. Later that night, I sat on the porch again, the torn letter in my lap, fireflies drifting like sparks in the humid air. The cicadas shrieked relentless, drowning out the laughter from inside. I held the sleeve up to the porch light and watched the paper glow through the plastic. Torn, scarred, incomplete, but still legible. Still undeniable. That's when I realized erasure doesn't succeed just because someone tears your name away. Erasure only wins if you let the pieces scatter. But if you gather them, hold them, document them, the story becomes stronger. The Carter family had their wine glasses, their car keys, their curated images. I had paper. Torn, fragile, imperfect, but mine. And paper, unlike people, does not lie. The night had wound itself down to whispers and clinking glasses. The dining room smelled of wine and roast meat, the remnants of yet another Carter performance scattered across the table. Half-empty plates, folded napkins stained with sauce. Sophie's phone buzzing with notifications from her latest post. Richard had retired to his chair by the fire, wine in hand, Nathan at his side, both of them laughing at some joke that never included me. I was gathering dishes when I felt a light touch at my elbow. Aunt Miriam's hand, small, trembling, wrapped in the faint scent of lavender soap. She leaned close, her voice no louder than the creak of the old floorboards. "Keep records, child," she whispered. "Paper lasts longer than pride." Her words sank into me like stones dropped into water, rippling outward, heavier than her usual small talk. I turned, startled, expecting her eyes to dart away like they always did when Richard spoke. But tonight she held my gaze, and in it I saw something sharp. something that had been buried under years of silence. Then she slipped something from her purse and pressed it into my hand. A Polaroid edges faded, the colors softened by time. My breath caught when I recognized it. A family picnic maybe 20 years ago. The grass golden, the sun bright. Richard raising a glass. Nathan grinning. Sophie years before she became a Carter laughing on the edge of the blanket. And there I was, right in the middle, hair tangled from the wind, laughing with my arms flung wide. I had forgotten that moment. Or maybe I had been taught to forget. I looked at Miriam, confusion in my eyes. She gave a faint, tired smile. I kept it, she said. Your father told me to throw it away. Said it wasn't flattering. But I knew. One day you'd need to remember you were there. The Polaroid was warm from her purse, but in my hands it felt electric. Proof small but undeniable that I hadn't always been invisible. That, once even in their carefully staged stories, I had been in the frame. Behind us, Richard's voice cut across the room sharp, even in his amusement. Emily, don't dawdle. Clear the table properly. His wine glass caught the firelight, glowing like a warning. I tucked the photo quickly into my sleeve before he could see. Miriam's rosary beads clinked softly as she pulled her hand back, retreating into the familiar posture of submission. But her whisper still echoed, paper lasts longer than pride. I finished the dishes in silence, my body moving automatically while my mind clung to her words. Pride, that was what this family lived on, fed on, built its empire on. Pride in Nathan's empty achievements. Pride in Sophie's staged perfection. Pride in Richard's toast that erased me every time it touched his lips. But pride, faded, cracked, revealed its hollowness. Paper didn't. Later, when the house had emptied into sleep, I sat on my bed and pulled the Polaroid from my sleeve. The edges glowed under the lamplight, fragile but intact. I slid it into the same plastic sleeve that now held the torn scholarship letter, the two pieces of proof nestled together like allies in their own right. Torn paper, faded photo, both stronger than the curated myths that had tried to erase me. I thought of Maya's USB, Jonah's briefcase, Miriam's rosary. Each object forming a chain small but unbreakable. Evidence, memory, truth. Outside, the cicadas had quieted their chorus, giving way to the low hum of crickets. The house itself groaned wood, settling under the weight of years. I leaned back against the headboard, the Polaroid pressed flat in my lap. For the first time, I didn't feel entirely alone. Miriam's whisper was more than advice. It was a confession, a passing of the torch. She had carried silence for decades, her beads marking time, her prayers dissolving into the air. Tonight she handed me something stronger than prayer evidence. Proof that someone else had seen, had remembered, had chosen not to erase me. The Carter family image machine could crop me out, laugh me silent, shred my letters, dismiss my voice. But they couldn't undo what was already captured, already written, already kept. Paper lasts longer than pride. And now, in the quiet of my room, with the Polaroid safe in my hands, I believed it. The hallway always smelled faintly of polish and dust, the kind of scent that clings to wood too old to remember its first shine. The portraits of Carter's past stared down at me as I walked, their painted eyes hard, and knowing the family crest stitched into each gilded frame like a warning, stay in your place. I was carrying my notebook under my arm, just a plain black cover, its pages mostly blank. For weeks I had felt it calling to me, whispering that silence wasn't enough anymore. Tonight I thought maybe I would start. Maybe I would write it all down. But halfway down the hall, Nathan stepped out from the shadows, car keys dangling from his hand like always. The jingle echoed in the narrow space, a predator's rattle. He leaned against the wall, blocking my path, the smirk already curling across his face. Dad will never believe you, he said, his voice low, cruelly certain. You're just the help here. The words hit harder than a slap. The help. That's what he saw me as, what they all did, though none of them ever said it aloud. I wasn't the daughter who stayed up through nights of study, or the nurse who kept strangers breathing, or the one who quietly held the family together when everyone else fell apart. No. To Nathan, I was staff. Background noise, disposable. I tried to step around him, but he shifted keys, flashing in the light. His smirk deepened. You think those scraps of paper you hoard mean anything? Dad laughs at you when you're not around. He says you cling to garbage like it's gold. For a moment, the air left my lungs. His words scraped across every wound, every dismissal, every time Richard had smiled at Nathan with pride and looked at me with something closer to irritation. But then underneath the sting, something steadied. I tightened my grip on the notebook. The pages were empty, yes, but not for long. I'm not the help, I whispered more to myself than to him. My voice trembled, but the words were real heavier than his keys, sharper than his smirk. Nathan laughed, the sound bouncing off the hall's narrow walls. You can write whatever fairy tales you want, Emily. No one's ever going to read them. You'll always be nothing here. But he didn't see it. He didn't see the shift happening right then in the silence after his threat. Because for the first time I realized the notebook wasn't just paper, it was a weapon. Not against him tonight. Maybe not tomorrow, but someday. I pushed past him, my shoulder brushing his laughter, following me down the hall. The portraits above seemed to lean closer, watching, judging. I ignored them. I climbed the stairs, heart-pounding notebook pressed tight against my chest. In my room, I locked the door and sat at the desk, the torn scholarship letter and Miriam's Polaroid laid out beside me, evidence already forming a constellation of truth. I opened the notebook, smoothed the first blank page, and picked up a pen. My hand shook as I began to write. He said I was the help. In my own house. In my own family. The ink bled into the paper, black and permanent. The page filled slowly, each word anchoring me, each sentence pulling me out of their narrative and into my own. Gaslight fades when you name it. Lies weaken when you write them down. Outside my window, the cicadas screamed into the night, louder than Nathan's laugh, louder than Richard's toasts, louder than Sophie's curated captions. Their chorus was wild and unfiltered proof that noise could carry even in the dark. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the notebook wasn't blank anymore, but alive with testimony. For the first time in years, I felt something close to power. Not because the words would change them, they wouldn't, but because they were mine. Nathan's threat still echoed. Dad will never believe you, but maybe belief wasn't the point. Paper doesn't need belief. Paper only needs time. And time, I knew, was on my side. I closed the notebook carefully, placed it on top of the torn letter and the Polaroid, and whispered into the quiet, I am not the help. I am the witness. The hallway could keep its shadows, the portraits could keep their stares, and Nathan could keep his keys. I had ink, and ink lasts longer than fear. It was 3 a.m. when the knock came. Not a polite knock, not even a desperate one. It was the kind that rattled the wood fists, pounding boots dragging across the porch like they owned it. I sat up in bed, the notebook still open beside me. Pen slipped from my hand hours earlier. My body tensed before my mind caught up. Emily, Nathan's voice slurred through the door, thick with whiskey and arrogance. Open up. I didn't move. The cicadas had gone silent outside, leaving only the hollow echo of his fists. I pressed my palms against the sheets, willing the noise to stop. But then came the crash, the door frame shuddering as he shoved it open, splinters breaking free. He staggered inside keys, still dangling from his hand like a weapon he didn't need. His grin was feral eyes, bloodshot, the smell of alcohol rolling off him in waves. Think you're better than me, he spat. Writing in your little book, keeping secrets. I barely had time to stand before his fist came down. Pain cracked across my cheek, white light sparking behind my eyes. I stumbled back, feet tangling in the rug body, collapsing against the desk. The notebook slid to the floor, pages flying open like a scream. Dad will never believe you. Nathan growled again, the same line he'd thrown in the hallway, only meaner, now heavier. His hand clamped around my arm and shoved me down. My knee scraped hard against the floor, blood rising fast, hot, and metallic. I gasped, trying to crawl, but his boot pressed against my ankle, pinning me like I was nothing more than furniture. He leaned down close enough for me to see the veins pulsing in his temple. You're the help, he whispered, voice trembling with rage. That's all you'll ever be. Behind him in the doorway, another figure appeared. My father. Richard stood there in his robe, a wine glass balanced casually in his hand, crimson liquid swirling in the lamplight. His lips curved, not in shock, not in horror, but in something colder, a smile. He didn't say stop. He didn't say enough. He only watched, savoring the spectacle like it was theater written for him alone. My breath rattled in my chest. The room tilted. My notebook lay open, words smeared across the page from where my blood had touched it. I am the witness. The sentence glared back at me, fragile but alive. I used what strength I had left to shove against the floor to crawl toward the door. Nathan's laugh chased me, bitter and sharp, but his grip loosened when I kicked wild and desperate. My knee burned as blood streaked down my leg, leaving a trail across the old wood. I made it past the threshold onto the porch. The boards groaned under me, cool night air biting at my face. My body trembled, half from fear, half from fury. Behind me, Richard's silhouette filled the doorway wine glass, catching the porch light. His smile lingered thin and cruel. And then, in the distance, a flicker of color, red and blue, slicing through the dark. The hum of an engine, the rising wail of sirens. Someone had called. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe fate itself. The lights drew closer, flashing against the trees, painting the porch in alternating shades of warning. Red, blue, red, blue. I dragged myself forward, each movement pulling fire through my leg until the glow swallowed me whole. Nathan's voice shouted behind me, muffled, now panicked. Richard's calm tone followed, smoother, rehearsed. But the lights didn't care. They pulsed, steady, indifferent to Carter pride, indifferent to curated images. The lights were truth arriving whether they wanted it or not. I collapsed at the edge of the gravel cheek, pressed to the cold earth. The sirens screamed louder, drowning out everything: Nathan's rage, Richard's cold laughter, Sophie's distant camera clicks. For once, their voices weren't the loudest in the room. As the first officer's boots hit the ground, the last thing I saw was the red and blue haze washing across my notebook where it had fallen on the porch. Its pages fluttered in the wind, stained with ink and blood, but unbroken. Proof. Even now. The ride to the station stretched on like a fever dream. Red and blue lights kept washing over the cruiser windows, pulsing against the glass, until it felt like my heartbeat was trying to match them. Every bump in the Texas road sent pain climbing from my knee up through my ribs, sharp, relentless, like my body was refusing to let me forget what had happened. I clutched my notebook against me. Its pages bent and stained, the words blurred with smears of blood. Still, I held it tight, as if the book itself were keeping me alive. When the car finally rolled to a stop, the fluorescent lights of the police station loomed above us, buzzing harsh and white against the dark dawn sky. I tried to stand when the door opened, but my legs gave way. I stumbled forward onto the concrete steps, and in that moment, my body chose for me. Everything caved. I collapsed, hard, cheek scraping against the rough surface, the cold seeping into my bones. The sound that escaped me wasn't a scream. It was quieter, ragged, the sound of something breaking but refusing to disappear. Boots thudded all around me, the air filling with radio static and hurried voices. Then one voice cut through it all. A young officer, close enough for me to see the panic in his eyes, dropped to his knees beside me. "Stay with us, ma'am. We've got you." His hands pressed firmly against the bleeding gash on my leg gloves, quickly slick with red. His voice was raw but urgent, a tether pulling me back every time the edges of the world went dark. I wanted to tell him everything. Every insult in the hallway. Every letter torn, every Polaroid hidden, every time my father smiled while erasing me. But my mouth was dry, my throat tight. No words came. The truth tangled inside me, caught between fury and exhaustion. But the blood spoke for me. It spread across the pavement, dripping into the cracks like ink writing its own testimony. No caption could crop it out. No smile could rewrite it. It was ugly, undeniable, permanent. Blood doesn't lie. Inside the station, the air smelled of burnt coffee and paper sharp under the hum of the lights. Officers steered me past rows of cluttered desks, phones ringing, typewriters clicking, plants with leaves browning in the corners. It didn't feel like safety, not yet. It felt like another test, another stage where I might vanish if I wasn't careful. The young officer guided me to a bench, crouching so his eyes met mine. "We'll get your statement when you're ready," he said, softer now, almost a promise. His words steadied me the way no words from my family ever had. I forced sound from my mouth, each word dragging itself up like a stone. He hit me. My voice cracked weak as thread. But once the words were out, they couldn't be erased. They hung in the air, heavier than my father's toasts, sharper than Nathan's laugh. And then I saw them. Richard walked in. First dressed now, no robe, no wineglass. His face arranged into solemn dignity, every move practiced. Nathan trailed close hair, combed back jaw, clenched in a performance of shame. Sophie came last, her phone tucked against her hip lens, just visible recording even now. They were ready to spin the narrative, to turn the collapse of my body into another Carter story with me cropped out. I couldn't shout. My voice wouldn't rise. My vision tilted shapes, blurring into streaks of color. So I clutched the sleeve of the young officer crouched at my side, grounding myself in the steadiness of someone who hadn't learned to smile at lies. He pressed the bandage harder against my knee. "Stay with us, ma'am. Just stay with us." His words looped like a lifeline, anchoring me as everything else slipped. Still, the blood marked everything, the floor beneath me, his gloves, my hands. It was everywhere now, spreading like proof they couldn't contain. Proof written in red, silent but impossible to deny. For once, I didn't feel invisible. Not because they had finally chosen to see me, but because my body had forced them to. Gaslight could twist words, crop photos, tear letters, but it could not erase what bleeds. The morning after the station felt unreal, as though the sirens and the blood and the harsh fluorescent lights had been nothing but a fever dream. My knee was stiff, wrapped in gauze, and every step sent a reminder of what had happened. Yet life in the town went on as if nothing had cracked open. The sun still burned down on the dust roads, the cicadas still screamed from the trees, and my father still held court wherever he chose. I walked into the feed store because I had to. Work didn't pause for bruises or bandages. The air inside was thick with the smell of grain and haywood dust floating like golden flecks in the beams of light that cut through the windows. Men leaned against sacks of seed. Women clutched ledgers, and a slow drawl of conversation filled the space. And then I heard it. Richard's laugh. Loud, practiced, carrying above everyone else's. He stood near the counter wine glass, replaced by a coffee cup he held like a prop. Nathan lounging beside him, Sophie at the doorway, scrolling her phone as if the whole scene were just another photo op. My father's eyes lit when he saw he had an audience. He leaned back, voice booming. "Emily." He said, his tone dripping with the kind of amusement that always made people lean in. "She always makes up stories for attention." The room chuckled, heads nodded. A man in overalls smirked and muttered something I couldn't hear. A woman by the counter offered a sympathetic laugh, the kind people use when they don't know the truth but want to stay on the right side of power. I froze, the sound of their agreement crashing over me louder than the sirens had. My father's words weren't just dismissal. They were a verdict delivered publicly with the town as jury. Gaslight wasn't confined to the Carter dining room anymore. It was spilling into the feed store, into the community, into the very air I had to breathe. Nathan shook his keys in his hand, smiling at the chorus of approval. Sophie raised her phone, not even pretending to hide it, capturing her husband's family with that practiced gleam. To her followers later, this would be another curated story, the proud patriarch, the loyal son, the silly daughter who cried wolf. I felt the room tilt. I wanted to scream, to pull out the torn scholarship letter, Miriam's Polaroid, the notebook filled with every wound. I wanted to show them my bandaged knee, to force them to look at the blood that had stained the station floor just hours before. But I knew it wouldn't matter, not here, not now. They had already decided who I was. The humiliation pressed down on me, hot and suffocating. My mother wasn't there to shush me with her lace handkerchief, but her voice still echoed in my head. "Don't make it worse, Emily." I clenched my jaw until my teeth ached. Aunt Miriam stood near the back, clutching her rosary beads. Her eyes lowered. She didn't speak, didn't contradict him, but she didn't laugh either. Her silence wasn't comfort, but it was something. I took a step-back notebook tight under my arm. The edges of the plastic sleeve inside pressed against me, the torn letter, the Polaroid fragments of proof that no public laugh could erase. Gaslight thrives on silence and spectacle, but paper waits. Paper outlives nods and chuckles. My father's smile widened as if he'd won something. "She's always been dramatic," he added, and the room chuckled again. I walked out without a word, the bell above the feed store door jangling in protest. The sun outside blinded me, harsh and unforgiving. My knee throbbed, my cheek still carried the shadow of Nathan's hand, but my steps were steady. Gaslight in public is meant to scorch, to shame, to erase, but it also leaves a trail. Every laugh, every nod, every dismissive glance, I was writing them down. They thought they were burying me. They didn't know I was building an archive. The town could nod. The room could laugh. Richard could smile. But blood dries, bruises fade. Paper endures. And one day I promised myself as I clutched the notebook closer, the evidence would speak louder than their laughter. Nights stretched longer after the station. Sleep was no longer a soft descent, but a restless vigil. I kept the notebook under my pillow, its spine pressing faintly against my cheek like a second heartbeat. It wasn't comfort, it was duty. Every night when the house creaked itself into silence, I pulled it out and wrote. Date. Time. Words spoken. The shape of bruises as they darkened and bloomed across my skin. The way Richard's lips curled when he told the town I craved attention. The way Nathan's laugh echoed in the hallway. Every mark, every sentence, every wound had its line, its place, its permanence. Ink spread across the pages like blood vessels, mapping not just my pain, but my survival. I wrote the way I used to chart vitals on patients, measured precise, unflinching. Because if my body was dismissed, if my voice was mocked, paper would not lie. One night after a double shift at the hospital, I found Maya waiting for me by the back entrance, the parking lot lit dim by a single yellow lamp. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her hair pinned up loosely, her face set with the kind of calm only exhaustion can teach. In her hand was something small, plastic, a faint flash of blue catching the light. She pressed it into my palm before I could even ask. "They can't delete this one," she whispered. I stared down at the tiny USB drive, its body no bigger than a house key. For a moment, it felt absurd that something so small could hold so much. But I knew what it was. The medical records, the copies of hospital reports they had tried to bury, the evidence of injuries I had patched up myself when no one else would acknowledge them. Every file's on there. Maya continued, her voice barely above the hum of the lamp. Scans, notes, timestamps. You think they'll erase it again? Let them try. This time you have a copy. I swallowed hard, the weight of the drive pressing into my palm, heavier than any heirloom. Why are you helping me? My voice cracked, not from doubt, but from the shock of being seen. Maya's eyes softened. Because I've watched you patch up other people's wounds for years while they left you bleeding. Because I know what it's like to have the truth hidden. And because you're not crazy, Emily. You're right. The air seemed to shift with those words. For so long, my family's chorus had drowned everything else out, imagines things, dramatic, wants attention. But here was another voice, quiet but steady, threading itself through the noise. I slid the USB into the notebook's plastic sleeve next to the torn scholarship letter and Aunt Miriam's Polaroid. The three artifacts pressed together, forming a strange Trinity paper photo digital memory. Proof in different languages, all saying the same thing: I was here. I endured, and I was not lying. Back in my room that night, I laid the notebook under my pillow again, the USB tucked safely inside. The house outside groaned and shifted Nathan's footsteps heavy down the hall. Richard's cough echoing faintly, Sophie's phone buzzing with her endless stream of curated lies. But under my pillow, I felt something new. Not just the ache of ink and paper, but the hum of possibility. I opened the notebook and began another entry. September 14th. Feed store. Richard laughed. Told the town I make up stories for attention. Nods, chuckles, silence. My knee still bleeds through the bandage at night. Maya gave me USB blue. Records they can't erase. My pen slowed, and for a moment I pressed the tip against the page until it bled a small pool of black. Then I wrote the last line deliberately, each letter carved into permanence. The archive grows. I slid the notebook back beneath the pillow, laid my head on top, and closed my eyes. The cicadas screamed outside the house, whispered inside, but between them and the small quiet I had carved for myself, I felt something close to strength. They could crop me from photos, shred letters, laugh me out of rooms, but they couldn't stop me from writing, from keeping, from archiving. And now with a blue USB tucked inside the notebook, they couldn't delete me either. The envelope was heavy, thicker than ordinary mail. Its seal cracked beneath my fingers with a sound that felt like the snapping of old bones. Inside the papers were stamped with the courthouse emblem, the kind of authority that makes the air shift even when you're alone in a room. My name was there in bold print, Emily Carter, not erased, not cropped, not whispered, but written plainly. A court summons. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words blurred, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of recognition. They had tried to bury me in silence, laughter gaslight, but here was something they couldn't twist with a caption or a smirk. A proceeding. A chance. That night, I called Jonah Reeves. He didn't answer at first, and for a heartbeat, I thought even he might have vanished into the chorus of denial. But then his voice came through steady and familiar like a door unlocking. "Emily," he said simply. I heard. The next day, he was at my doorstep, the Texas sun cutting across his shoulders, his briefcase dangling from his hand. It was the same old leather one he had carried since law school. Edges worn, corners scuffed, handle softened by years of use. He had once joked that it was older than most of his clients. Today, it looked like a weapon. He stepped inside, nodded toward the stack of papers on my kitchen table, and placed the briefcase beside them. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, the kind of calm that made me realize just how much panic I was carrying. "We don't need their approval." Jonah said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "We need evidence." The words landed with the force of scripture. For so long I had fought for approval, Richard's smile, Nathan's acknowledgement. Sophie's camera angle, my mother's quiet nod. Approval had been the currency of survival in the Carter house, and I had always come up short. Evidence. That was different. Evidence didn't care if Richard raised his glass or if Sophie found the right filter. Evidence didn't bend to Nathan's laugh or Laura's handkerchief. Evidence stood whether they believed it or not. I slid the notebook across the table. Jonah opened it carefully, his fingers tracing the ink like it was fragile glass. Page after page he read in silence. Dates, times, words, bruises, gasps written in hurried script. He paused at the plastic sleeves, pulling out the torn scholarship letter, the Polaroid Aunt Miriam had saved, the blue USB Maya had pressed into my palm. He laid them out in a line on the table, his eyes sharp. "This," he said. "Tapping the torn letter is motive. They denied you before you even started." His hand moved to the Polaroid. "This is presence, proof you were there." Finally, he held the USB aloft, its blue plastic catching the kitchen light. "And this," he said, "is survival. Medical records don't lie." I felt my chest tighten, not from fear, but from the rawness of being believed. Jonah didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss. He didn't tell me I was imagining things. He treated every scrap, every word, every scar as something that mattered. For the first time, my archive wasn't just mine. It had become a case. Jonah leaned back his briefcase, open, his expression calm but fierce. The Carters thrive on performance. But in court, performance dies under oath. Paper photos, records, that's where we fight. Not in their dining room, not in their feed store. Here. He tapped the summons. In this arena, truth has teeth. I sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the kitchen, the cicadas screaming faintly through the open window. I thought of Richard laughing in public, Nathan's threats in the hallway, Sophie's captions, Laura's silence. I thought of every night I had written with trembling hands, every entry that felt like shouting into a void. And now Jonah was telling me the void was gone. The words were being read. Will they believe me? I asked finally, the question slipping out like a wound I hadn't meant to expose. Jonah closed the briefcase with a soft snap. Belief is optional, he said. Evidence is not. The papers on the table rustled in the breeze from the open window. My name stared back at me from the summons, heavy, undeniable. I touched the edge of the page, the ink rough beneath my fingertips. For years, they had written me out of the story. But now the story had shifted into a place where their edits could not reach. The court wasn't family dinner. It wasn't the feed store. It wasn't a church pew where laughter drowned me out. The court was paper stacked high, evidence cataloged, voices transcribed. It was a place where she imagines things wouldn't be enough. That night, I slid the notebook back under my pillow. Its weight different now. Not just a secret, but a weapon. The torn letter, the Polaroid, the USB, all of it waiting. All of it ready. I whispered into the darkness, not as a plea, but as a promise. We don't need their approval. We need evidence. And for the first time, I believed it. The courthouse smelled of old wood and paper, a mix of dust and polish that clung to the walls like history itself refused to leave. When I stepped inside, the sound of voices hit me first. The gallery was packed, neighbors, townspeople, even the same faces that had nodded along at the feed store when my father laughed me off as dramatic. They had come not because they believed me, but because scandal had finally dragged the Carter name into public light. My knee still ached beneath its bandage as I walked to the plaintiff's table, notebook pressed against my chest. Jonah was already there, his leather briefcase resting beside him like an old soldier ready for battle. He gave me a small nod, steady as always, the kind of anchor I had never known in my own blood. Across the aisle sat Richard, immaculate in his tailored suit, Nathan rigid beside him. Sophie holding her phone just out of sight, though everyone could guess it was still recording. My mother's eyes flickered nervously, her handkerchief clenched in white knuckles. Aunt Miriam sat further back, rosary beads slipping through her fingers, lips moving in silent prayer. When the judge entered the room, hushed the scrape of the gavel echoing like thunder. The proceedings began, words passing in a rhythm of formality I had only ever seen on television. Objections, exhibits, motions. But beneath the structure, my heart pounded wild, every beat reminding me that this wasn't just paper anymore. It was my life spread open for everyone to see. Jonah rose when it was time. He moved with a calm confidence, his voice unshaken, as he introduced the first piece of evidence. He placed the torn scholarship letter on the stand, the jagged edges clear beneath the fluorescent lights. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. He showed the Polaroid Miriam had saved the frozen smile of a younger me in a family that would rather I'd been cropped out. And then finally, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small recorder. The room shifted uneasy. Jonah pressed play. At first, it was silence. Then came the sound I had heard so many times in my nightmares, fists pounding against my bedroom door. Nathan's voice slurred and venomous. "Open up, Emily. You think you're better than me?" The echo of wood splintering filled the courtroom, sharp and undeniable. And then laughter. My father's laughter, low and cold, a chuckle that slithered through the speakers and settled into the room like poison. The gallery stiffened. People leaned forward, some covering their mouths, others shifting uncomfortably. These were the same neighbors who had nodded when Richard told them I was making things up, who had chuckled when he called me dramatic. Now they had to hear it for themselves. They couldn't crop it, couldn't scroll past it. My throat tightened as the recording ended. Silence rushing back into the room like a tide. The judge cleared his throat, but Jonah lifted a hand as if to say there was one more thing. He turned toward me, his eyes steady. "It's your choice," he whispered. I stood slowly. My legs shook, but I willed them still. The gallery's eyes pinned me in place, neighbors, colleagues, even strangers. People who had let me bleed in silence, now forced to listen. I faced the judge first, then the crowd, and finally my father. My voice wavered at first, but grew stronger with each word. That laugh, I said, the sound cracking in my memory, hurt more than any bruise. The room held its breath. Even Sophie lowered her phone. Nathan's jaw clenched. Richard's smile faltered, if only for a flicker, as though he hadn't expected me to name it so plainly. I pressed my notebook against my chest, feeling the weight of every page inside it, every record of words and wounds I had carried alone. For the first time, I wasn't whispering into silence. I wasn't scribbling in the dark. I was speaking into a room where denial had no place to hide. The judge nodded, eyes sharper now. Jonah sat back down, the briefcase closed but triumphant. And the gallery neighbors who had laughed at me nodded at Richard, sat stunned in their seats, the truth ringing louder than their chuckles ever had. That day, the Carter image cracked under oath. Not because I screamed, not because I fought harder than their gaslight, but because the evidence had finally spoken in a voice they couldn't erase. And I had found mine. The air inside the courtroom had turned heavy, as though the recording of my father's laugh still hung in the rafters, clinging to every ear. People shifted in their seats, but no one spoke. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, fragile but charged, waiting for the next crack of thunder. And then Aunt Miriam stood. Her hands trembled as she clutched her rosary beads, but her eyes, usually lowered, usually avoiding conflict, were fixed straight ahead. She reached into her purse, pulling out something folded carefully in wax paper. The sound of it unwrapping echoed louder than it should have, brittle against the hush. A photograph slid into the light. A Polaroid edges, faded colors worn. But there I was, younger, smaller, holding a certificate in my hands. A certificate I hadn't seen in years, one that had disappeared the same week Richard told me I imagined things. My name was written across it in block letters. Excellence in nursing prep. Proof that I had been recognized once. Proof that it wasn't all in my head. Miriam's voice quavered, but she didn't sit back down. She earned this. I kept it when they told me to throw it away. I couldn't throw her away. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Faces that once nodded at Richard's jokes now turned toward him, searching for explanation. And then another voice broke through. Pastor Davis, sitting stiff in the back row, cleared his throat, his hands pressed against the pew in front of him as if bracing for impact. She told me years ago, he admitted, his head lowering. I chose silence. I thought it was family business. I see now that silence was complicity. His words fell like stones into water, sending ripples through the room. The man who had once called Nathan a fine son in front of the entire congregation now bent his head in confession. The gallery rustled with whispers, the tide shifting. Every sound of approval Richard had once commanded in public began to erode. And then finally it was Richard himself who spoke. He rose slowly, his suit sharp, his face still composed, but his eyes betrayed him. Tired, cornered, stripped of polish. I protected what was mine, he said. Voice rough, the mask cracking. The words rang hollow. What was mine? Not family, not truth possession. He wasn't defending love. He was defending control. The judge leaned forward, his gavel striking, once the sound reverberating like a final chord. Fraud proven. Custody frozen pending review. The gallery erupted not in cheers, not in outrage, but in a stunned murmur, like the sound of a community realizing the story they had believed for decades was never real. I stood straighter, my notebook pressed against me. My knees still aching, but my back unbent. For the first time, the evidence wasn't only in my hands. It was spilling into the open, carried by others who had chosen silence for too long and were finally speaking. Miriam wiped her eyes with the edge of her rosary, her Polaroid still visible on the table. Pastor Davis remained, bowed his shoulders, heavy but unburdened. And my father, Richard Carter, patriarch, toast giver, master of gaslight, sat down slowly, his mask gone, his empire fractured. The gavel struck again, sealing it. In that moment, I felt the world tilt. Not in collapse, but in correction. For years, I had been told to sit by the door, to accept erasure as normal, to swallow the laugh that cut deeper than bruises. But here, under oath, in front of neighbors and strangers, the truth had spoken. Gaslight can twist laughter, can wound, silence can suffocate. But once voices break free, once evidence is laid bare, no mask can hold. And for the first time, I believed this story wasn't theirs to tell anymore. It was mine. The courthouse doors swung open with a weighty groan, spilling me into the Texas evening. The heat hit my face first, thick with dust and cicada song, but the air felt different now. Lighter. Not because justice had erased everything, but because the truth had finally been spoken where silence used to rule. I stepped slowly down the stone stairs, notebook clutched against my chest. The leather strap pressed into my palm edges, bent from years of hiding under pillows, beneath drawers, behind locked doors. But today, for the first time, I held it in plain sight. No more hiding. No more whispering in the dark. The sun hovered low on the horizon, bleeding orange and red across the sky. Light reflected on the courthouse windows, turning them into mirrors of fire. Behind me, I could still hear the echo of the gavel, the whispers of neighbors trying to reconcile what they'd heard with the myths they'd believed for decades. I didn't turn back. Their reckoning was theirs to face. Jonah walked beside me, his old briefcase in hand. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. His silence wasn't the silence I'd known all my life. His was steady, respectful a silence that gave space for my voice instead of smothering it. When we reached the bottom step, he touched my shoulder once lightly and said, "You did it." But I knew better. We did it. Every entry in my notebook, every torn letter, every Polaroid saved every file hidden on a blue USB. And every ally, Maya with her steady eyes, Miriam with her trembling hands, Jonah with his calm insistence that had reminded me proof could outlast denial. I paused at the final step and looked out at the small crowd gathered in the square. Some faces lowered their eyes ashamed. Others studied me as if seeing me for the first time. For years I had been their ghost, cropped out of pictures, laughed out of rooms, spoken about only as a burden. Now I stood where they could not look away. I lifted the notebook not high like a trophy, but firm, steady like the evidence it had always been. My voice carried, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the cicadas. My father gave my brother land. I said the words, tasting of every wound, every bruise, every laugh that had erased me. My mother gave me her voice. I know which one lasts longer. A hush fell thicker than any gavel strike. For the first time, silence was mine, not forced on me, not weaponized against me, but chosen. And I filled it with my own words. I turned then, letting the sunset bathe me in red gold light, the shadows of the courthouse stretching long behind me. Each step away from those doors felt like stepping out of their narrative and into my own. The notebook pressed against my ribs like a second heartbeat, alive, undeniable. When I reached the edge of the square, I stopped and whispered into the Texas dusk, my words carried by the dry wind and the hum of cicadas. Silence never protects. I broke mine. The sun dipped lower, setting fire to the horizon. I didn't flinch. I didn't look back. For the first time, I walked forward, not as the erased daughter of Richard Carter, not as the shadow cropped out of Sophie's frames, but as the keeper of my own record. The proof was mine. The voice was mine. And the story was finally mine. Have you ever been erased by your own family? 1, several, yes. 0, 0 no. Comment below.